Welcome to this explainer. If you look at a modern map of global spheres of influence, it's pretty easy to make assumptions based purely on political systems. Because China and Vietnam are both Asian nations governed by communist parties, you'd naturally expect them to be the closest of allies, right? Perfectly aligned in their worldview. But well, history rarely follows our straightforward assumptions. Today we're going to unpack a major conflict that completely shatters that expectation. It's a forgotten war from 1979 that really reveals just how incredibly complex international relations can be.
Okay, let's dive right into this jarring historical paradox that totally flips our assumptions about the Cold War map. Because the reality of the situation is honestly staggering. Only 4 years after defeating the United States, Vietnam faced a new enemy. This time, it wasn't a capitalist superpower. It was Communist China. Just let that sink in for a second. Vietnam had literally just emerged from a devastating, decades-long conflict, only to immediately find itself staring down the barrel of an invasion from its massive northern neighbor.
And this brilliant contrast right here perfectly illustrates our core dilemma. Two neighboring nations sharing the exact same communist ideology actually turning their guns on each other. On paper, they absolutely should have been locked arm in arm. China had even helped North Vietnam defend itself earlier on, but the geopolitical reality? Completely different. Instead of communist solidarity, they became bitter enemies, locked in a violent border struggle.
So, that brings us to the absolutely massive question at the center of this explainer. Why did China attack Vietnam in 1979? What could possibly drive such a deep wedge between two nations that seemingly had so much in common?
Well, our core thesis today is pretty simple. There is far more to geopolitics than just what countries say they believe in. An ideological label like communism is just a starting point. It doesn't magically override national security interests or border anxieties or the really complex webs of shifting global alliances. Ideology might have been the language these countries spoke, but make no mistake, geopolitics was the actual game they were playing.
To really get how we arrived at this point, we need to break down the 4 specific dominoes that created the conditions for this conflict. It wasn't just one single spark, it was a whole cascading series of historical shifts we're looking at. We're looking at the Sino-Soviet split, the changing dynamics of the Vietnam War, the crisis in Cambodia, and lastly, the rise of Deng Xiaoping in China. Let's walk through them.
The first domino was the bitter divorce between the Soviet Union and China. Initially, Stalin and Mao were actually pretty close. But in 1953, when Stalin died, his successor Nikita Khrushchev began this process of de-Stalinization, basically calling out Stalin's use of terror and his cult of personality. Well, Mao took this incredibly personally because it applied just as much to his own leadership style. The alliance fractured. Mao then tried to out-industrialize the Soviets with the Great Leap Forward to become the true global leader of communism. By the decade between 1956 and 1966, Mao had stationed a whopping 1.5 million soldiers along the Soviet border. So yeah, the two central communist powers were now officially divorced.
Which brings us to factor number 2, the shifting alliances of the Vietnam War. Geopolitical lines were completely redrawn by 1975 into a brand new balance of power. Early in the Vietnam War, you had the classic setup, the US supporting the South and the Soviets and China supporting the North. Capitalists versus communists. Simple enough, right? But remember that Sino-Soviet split we just talked about? As those tensions escalated, China actually withdrew its support from Vietnam just to focus on defending against the Soviets. Then, incredibly, US President Nixon meets with Mao in 1972 to normalize relations. So by the time the South fell in 1975, the global lines weren't capitalist versus communist anymore. It was now a tentative alignment of China and America, acting as a counterbalance against the Soviets and Vietnam. The whole board flipped.
Factor 3. Cambodia. Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia directly threatened China's regional interests. Previously, Vietnamese communists and the Cambodian Khmer Rouge had actually cooperated, but when Pol Pot took power in Cambodia, he became intensely paranoid about Vietnamese control. He imprisoned soldiers sympathetic to Vietnam, blocked their bases, the whole 9 yards. Now, Mao had maintained close ties with Pol Pot, and China kept up that friendly relationship even after Mao died. But in 1978, Vietnam invades Cambodia, and by January 1979, Pol Pot is forced to flee the capital. From China's perspective, this was a massive red flag. With the US having backed away from Vietnam, and Vietnam now occupying a Chinese ally in Cambodia, tensions were literally at a boiling point.
Finally, the fourth factor. Deng Xiaoping consolidates power in China.
Following Mao's death, his chosen successor was outmaneuvered by Deng Xiaoping, who had the real support of the party. Deng took firm control, managed some nasty inflation, and then, right after Vietnam invaded Cambodia, he takes a highly significant trip to the United States to visit President Jimmy Carter. When he returned home in February of 1979, a critical moment occurred. The original 1950 Sino-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance officially expired. Free from that treaty, and feeling increasingly aligned with the U.S., Deng felt confident enough to act. He announced that China would launch a limited invasion of Vietnam.
That brings us to February 17, 1979. 200,000 Chinese soldiers rolled across a 1,300-kilometer border into Vietnam on two distinct fronts. 200,000! Just think about the sheer scale of that mobilization. It instantly transformed a tense ideological standoff into a massive, boots-on-the-ground military conflict.
The invasion itself was an incredibly fast blitz. China's stated goal for this limited invasion was to force Vietnam to pull its troops out of Cambodia to defend their homeland. Less than 2 weeks in, the Chinese captured the provincial capital of Cao Bang. They were hoping to lure the main Vietnamese forces into a huge city battle at Lang Son. But Vietnam had a totally different strategy. They kept the fighting in the rural areas and completely refused to take the bait. Because of that, the city of Lang Son fell relatively uncontested on March 4th. Now, Vietnam did pull about 300,000 soldiers out of Cambodia for defense, but it wasn't the complete withdrawal China demanded. Regardless, on March 5th, China suddenly ordered its forces to withdraw. But here's the kicker. As they left, they executed a brutal scorched earth policy, systematically destroying infrastructure, property, and farmland, all the way until the withdrawal was completed on March 16th. Now, looking at all this devastation, you're probably wondering, where were the Soviets? Why didn't Vietnam's powerful Soviet allies intervene to protect them during the invasion? After all, the shifting alliances of the 70s heavily positioned the Soviets as Vietnam's primary international backer. Why would they just sit back and watch? Well, the history shows that the Soviets were practically paralyzed. They simply couldn't reach Vietnam without triggering a massive global conflict or reopening their own contested border skirmishes. It was a sheer problem of geography. For the Soviets to send physical reinforcements, they would have had to move troops or supplies through territory controlled either by China or by U.S. allies. Their only other option was to forcefully reopen those highly contested border skirmishes with China that we talked about earlier. And frankly, the Soviets were absolutely not keen to risk a massive war on their own borders. So they were effectively locked out of the entire conflict.
The human cost of all this was staggering. Now, casualty figures are highly contested by all sides, with China, Vietnam, and Western observers all throwing out different numbers. But if we take the Western estimates as a neutral baseline, since they weren't directly involved in the fighting, it cuts through some of the propaganda. According to these estimates, China suffered roughly 26,000 deaths, while Vietnam suffered about 30,000 deaths. That is over 50,000 lives lost in a war that lasted only 27 days from invasion to withdrawal.
But the impact went way beyond those 27 days. The ripple effects were absolutely enormous. For China, Deng Xiaoping was actively trying to liberalize the economy using special economic zones. Shenzhen was established in '78, but the war forced other provinces, like Guangzhou, to severely delay their economic zones until late 1979. For Vietnam, the war didn't force them out of Cambodia, but it did generate a massive global backlash against their occupation. Almost nobody outside the Soviet bloc recognized the Vietnamese-backed leadership in Cambodia, trapping Vietnam in a long cycle of international isolation. Furthermore, the violence didn't truly end there. There was a significant border skirmish in 1984, and even a naval battle over the contested Spratly Islands as late as 1988. It actually took 2 full decades for the dust to finally settle, proving just how deeply this brief war fractured the relationship between these two neighbors. It wasn't until 1989 that armed conflict truly ended, which, not coincidentally, is when Vietnam finally agreed to fully withdraw from Cambodia. 2 years later, in 1991, China and Vietnam officially normalized their relations, and it took until 1999, 20 years after the initial invasion, for the two nations to finally sign a comprehensive border pact. So, let's end on this provocative thought. Looking at the messy, complicated aftermath of this historical paradox, who really won this forgotten war? The official historical consensus labels the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War a stalemate. China didn't achieve its primary goal of forcing Vietnam out of Cambodia immediately, but Vietnam suffered immense infrastructural damage and years of international isolation. So looking at the long-term aftermath, who do you think came off best? It's a complex question, and it really reminds us just how fascinating and unpredictable geopolitics can be. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the history you think you know.